as a young writer, as it did on many other. In fact, Burroughs' initial audience was almost exclusively other writers. General public found him first too distasteful and second too difficult. Burroughs is a man without hope at all. So his vision is the darkest part of the tunnel. There's one passage in Beautiful Losers, which I think is a play on Burroughs' Naked Lunch. In Naked Lunch, there's a very famous part called the talking asshole routine. A ventriloquist who works in a circus teaches his asshole how to talk. And pretty soon the asshole develops his own identity and begins to basically exist independently of the sponsor. And it's very anarchic and it's hilarious, you know, but it was considered very shocking. Well, Cohen in his novel has a vibrator that becomes autonomous. Doesn't need electricity, doesn't need human control, takes over. So it seems to be an acknowledgement of reading a writer like Burroughs.
Yet where these influences may have been present in his novel Beautiful Losers, as his career developed, Cohen would not continue to share any real affinity with them. Burroughs' continued extremity and notorious heroin addiction would eventually propel him into an underground fame, although he remained a more marginal figure. Kerouac, on the other hand, fell deeper into the inebriation in which Cohen had first found him in 1957, and unable to rediscover the early spontaneous energy of On the Road, died a broken man by the end of the 60s. Ginsberg, however, remained a vital force in American culture, and although they perhaps did not share obvious stylistic affinities, he was nevertheless an inspiration for Cohen.
I think that Ginsberg demonstrated to Cohen some of the ways in which one could make a very public career of being a poet. Now, Cohen was never as openly political as Ginsberg. And Cohen never embraced political causes in the same way. But I think the extent to which Cohen has succeeded in sustaining over 4 decades a public career with a feeling that what he says in some way matters.
These are individuals, Ginsberg and Cohen, who, though they feel the despair profoundly, are able to balance it with a kind of affirmative going on and still trying to the very end to do whatever one can. I think it's a belief. I think it's a commitment. I think it's a passion. You know, that Ginsberg, right to the end, is singing and performing right to the very end.
In fact, although Kerouac's link to the jazz movement has been pronounced over time, Ginsberg was the most musical of the Beats. And he, like Cohen, saw the potential artistic and cultural power that the singer, rather than the poet, would begin to establish by the mid-1960s.
Ginsberg and Cohen are both people who understood the relationship between poetry and music. You know, I mean, Ginsberg has done records and was very fascinated with people who were taking poetry or poetic lyrics and putting them forward in a musical form.
Hey, Father Death, I'm flying home. Hey, poor man, you're all alone. Hey, old daddy, I know where I'm going. Old Auntie Death, don't hide your bones. Old Uncle Death, I hear your groans. Oh, Sister Death, how sweet your moans.
They shared a similar set of concerns. I think that they both had a high regard for what poetry is in and of itself. At the same time as I think that they also saw music as something that both added an important element to what poetry could be and also created the possibility of a wider audience for it. You know, I think, you know, even as we see Leonard Cohen as, in many ways, the epitome of a serious artist, you know, somebody who was doing what he did, you know, almost regardless of whether the audience was there, I think he was also interested in reaching an audience, you know, so that, you know, having done the work, I think he wanted to find ways to get the work to larger numbers of people. And I think, you know, as happy as he was with the literary success, for example, that he enjoyed in Canada, I don't think that was enough for him.
It's true that all the men you knew were dealers who said they were through with dealing every time you gave them shelter. I know that kind of man. It's hard to hold the hand of anyone who's reaching for the sky just to surrender. Who is reaching for the sky just to surrender. And sweeping up.
When Cohen did evolve into a singer and songwriter, this wasn't simply a transition made at whim. Music had always been a key part of Cohen's artistic upbringing and development, and it was all but inevitable that at some stage he would pursue an active involvement with it. At the time when he was gravitating towards the work of Lorca, he was also playing simple folk songs at a Jewish summer camp and developing an understanding of music.
Leonard's earliest interests are, of course, in folk music. And he picks up the guitar because he wants to impress girls. He's 15, and he meets a young Spanish fellow at a park who will offer to give him some music lessons, and you know, that's where he learns his first 3 or 4 chords. And then he realizes that, well, it could be quite interesting if I could write maybe something to go along, and I have some thoughts about these odd things, and so he begins to write. Did he write songs or did he write poetry? Even he probably couldn't distinguish between the two. It's not either or. They're happening at the same time. In other words, he's beginning to write his poetry at the very time he's beginning to make some gestures towards being a singer.
And just as this first blossoming musical interest in the early 1950s was centered around folk, when he finally did emerge as a new talent in the late 60s, this was again the genre that he was drawn to. Yet folk music had altered drastically over the 15 years, and where Cohen had initially been singing popular campfire songs, by 1966 the scene had evolved into something else entirely. In the early 50s, the popularity of left-leaning political singer and songwriter Pete Seeger had brought about the first major folk revival. Yet this spark had died down during the middle of the decade amid the persecutions of the Red Scare, and the scene had once again gone underground. Here it slowly gathered momentum through the coffee house circuit, blending into the beatnik scene along with jazz and poetry. Although it popularly re-emerged through the conspicuously conservative Kingston Trio, by the close of the decade a new breed of folk singers followed who were openly political, spearheaded by Joan Baez. It was into this scene that Cohen would eventually be welcomed, although it was not necessarily a comfortable fit.
Well, I think we could start by saying that there are 2 forms of folk music, 2 major strands in folk music, which Cohen has never exhibited any great interest in. That is, he has never been interested in going back and finding the old ballads, the old songs sung by farmers in the fields, the authentic Appalachian or Scottish Highland centuries-old folk song. Similarly, one of the dominant forms of quote-unquote folk music in the early 60s was the political protest song. And that, again, is something that Cohen has shown no interest in whatsoever.
Our mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can lend your hand, for the times they are a-changing.
If you take these 2 things away from mid-1960s folk music, I mean, basically all that's left is the notion of the guy with the acoustic guitar who may well, from mid-60s on, be singing his or her own songs. The ideal of the singer-songwriter working in a fairly simple musical medium is the aspect of folk music which Cohen was able to exploit.
This area of folk music had not existed when Cohen had first picked up a guitar in his teenage years. It was introduced by the most prominent member of the 1960s folk revival, the singer-songwriter Bob Dylan. An artist with an encyclopedic knowledge of traditional music, he was also greatly inspired by the beats, by the French symbolists and surrealism. By the middle of the decade, he had single-handedly